In case you're not aware, I'm going to be speaking at the Better Discourse event, April 24th, Kenosha, Wisconsin. I'm going to be on a panel. It's going to be amazing. There's a bunch of YouTubers, all these amazing people. Get your tickets now, link in the description. Let's get into the video. One of the things I absolutely do not enjoy about online political discourse at this very moment is the overuse of the term grifter. And I understand that this word has its place. I understand that there are certain people or organizations that give you the impression that they're not really saying or advocating what they're advocating for out of good intent, but they are doing so in order to make money because they think this is the more popular position. But honestly, even if we are to take that at face value, that the person that's always being referred to as a grifter is a grifter, you have not made any substantial point against that person's argument. I think back to Ann Coulter. Ann Coulter, who is often attacked and chided as somebody who doesn't believe the things that she says because they're too outrageous. She's just saying that to make money. And her retort to these charges, Ann Coulter would reply to people and say, essentially, what would it say about you if I, not even believing the things I was saying, became a best-selling author and this major political figure, while you, who are advocating for your beliefs in earnest, are a complete failure or in no way comparable to me? You get where I'm going with this? Calling somebody a grifter on its own is not a counter-argument. It's just a label to throw on your political opponents that's as overused and generic as so many others. And in fact, when you call somebody a grifter, you are saying that you don't think that they believe what they actually are saying, but if you can't argue against them, that leads me to believe that you are worse than somebody who's not even being earnest, which reflects even more poorly on you. And on top of that, the fact that we overuse this term so much in our culture doesn't leave room for an even greater phenomenon that I think is way more present throughout our political discourse than people care to acknowledge. And that is, people don't know things. I got news for you. There are way more people in online political commentary that don't know what they're talking about and are successful than there are people doing these Machiavellian schemes in order to generate the most amount of money saying things that they don't actually believe. And the reason for this is these people's audiences are full of people who are even dumber than they are. You see, when we call everybody grifters, we lose our ability to point out that there are people on the internet doing political commentary with enormous channels that are just not that bright. They're just not that informed. They're just not as logical as they present themselves as. That's why I always talk about people getting their talking points from Kyle Kulinski, who he himself is not that intelligent. He's not that deep of a thinker. I don't talk a lot about people changing their positions for money, even though that's the popular thing to do on the internet. And somebody who's extremely guilty of that is Hunter Avallone. And in fact, one of the videos that we're going to talk about today, because yes, we're doing two Hunter Avallone videos, or at least a piece of a second one after I go through the first one. Hunter calls PragerU a bunch of grifters for having a donation link.
Also, really love this right here. You literally cannot get the PragerU video without the grift. Donate to help PragerU fight censorship.
On a video where Hunter Avallone, of course, has a donation link. Now, again, I don't think Hunter Avallone is a grifter, even though by his standards he is, because asking for donations makes you a grifter because he has that donation link in there. I just think that he's somebody who doesn't know a lot about politics. He's not very well informed, and he often just doesn't dig deep into the topics that he's talking about. And I'm going to show you that by looking over his video, 5-minute facts related to the minimum wage. And I have to say, I'm actually incredibly impressed by this video because somehow absolutely everything manages to be wrong with this video. First, from the title alone, it's called 5-Minute Facts, and the video is 8 minutes long.
We should ask, why do we even have a minimum wage in the first place? The purpose of the minimum wage was to stabilize the post-depression economy and protect the workers in the labor force.
Now, when I say everything is wrong in this video, I mean literally everything is incorrect in this video. So he just said that the first minimum wage in the United States of America was passed to stabilize the post-depression economy. That is not the case. The minimum wage was passed during the Great Depression in 1931, first for federal contracts in the Davis-Bacon Act. Then in 1933, this got overturned by the Supreme Court because the federal government has no authority for minimum wage. And then again in 1938. None of these were after the Great Depression was over. These were all during the Great Depression.
The minimum wage was designed to create a minimum standard of living to protect the health and well-being of employees. Others have argued that the primary purpose was to aid the lowest paid of the nation's working population.
So one of the oddities about this video is that Hunter Avallone, and largely people on the left, present the minimum wage as if its stated purpose was the only purpose, point blank period, when in reality we know different. The Davis-Bacon Act, which was the first foray of the federal government into some type of minimum wage, was modeled specifically after a Canadian piece of legislation meant to price Japanese migrant workers out of the timber market. And the reason Davis-Bacon requires, and by the way, it's still in the books to this very day, prevailing wages in all federal government construction contracts is because minority construction firms were outcompeting white construction firms because they were paying their workers less. The only way to compete against discrimination is to make people pay the cost of discrimination. You want to hire whites only? You're going to pay a premium for that when you could get the job done cheaper and just as good with these minority-owned construction companies. And since the Democratic Party needed the Dixiecrats in order to pass any bit of FDR's agenda, this was included with his agenda. Now, after this piece of legislation worked in pricing minorities out of federal government contract work, they tried again in the National Recovery Act. And again, in a boon to Southern Dixiecrats, they threw in a national minimum wage. But thankfully, this minimum wage was struck down by the Supreme Court. Because while Congress did have the right to pay whatever wages they wanted when it came to federal government contracts, the Supreme Court, before FDR threatened to pack it, an overtly fascistic move, didn't recognize the federal government's authority, because it does not exist, to fix wages or any type of prices in the marketplace. However, post threatening to pack the court in 1938, FDR was successful in passing a national minimum wage. And just as the first minimum wage was intended, the purpose of this floor in labor was to decrease the price somebody would pay for discrimination and cripple African Americans and other ethnic minorities' ability to compete via lower wages with their white counterpart.
Currently, workers who earn the federal minimum wage make about $7.25 an hour, and that is about 29% less per hour than their counterparts made 50 years ago after adjusting for inflation.
Now, we hear a ton of different metrics about how the minimum wage, if it adjusted for inflation, would be $25 an hour, would be $30 an hour, would be $57 an hour. But in reality, if we pegged the original minimum wage to inflation, it would be $4.54. Which is significantly lower than our current minimum wage, but whatever.
This is quite interesting because despite receiving 29% less per hour, minimum wage workers' productivity has gone up significantly. From 1979 to 2018, net productivity rose 69.6%, while the hourly pay of typical workers essentially stagnated, increasing only 11.6% over 39 years after adjusting for inflation.
So this is absolutely great, because Hunter Avallone is using a chart that I have previously debunked on this channel. However, I didn't really go fully into everything that was wrong with this chart in the previous video. In that video, I talked about the relationship on capital as a substitute for labor and how that can explain some of the disparity between productivity and hourly compensation. In this video, I'm going to talk about what this chart actually measures and why it is incredibly deceptive and why it's actually used by Hunter Avallone in a really deceptive way. So if you listen to him incredibly carefully, you'll hear him say net productivity versus the typical hourly worker's compensation.
Net productivity rose 69.6%, while the hourly pay of typical workers...
Now, why is that important? Well, first, we need to talk about where this chart comes from. It comes from the Economic Policy Institute, which is a very left-leaning organization that receives a lot of their contributions from labor unions who historically lobby for increases in the minimum wage because it helps them. Because if they price out less skilled labor, then people are more likely to opt for union workers. Because even though you pay more, the difference between what you're paying and what their productivity is significantly less. If you price up low-skilled labor, then those people become less advantageous for you to hire instead of union workers. This is why unions are always for raising the minimum wage, despite the fact that their workers always make well above minimum wage. Now, anytime you have statistics from an advocacy organization, you have to be incredibly skeptical when their statistical data lines up perfectly with their advocacy. However, you don't dismiss them out of hand. You actually have to look into the data in order to figure out whether or not they check their biases before putting out these charts. Now, I'm going to point out first and foremost that we are comparing now Instead of minimum wage workers to their productivity, we're talking about typical workers, which is a complete moving of the goalposts. And regardless of whether or not this chart is true or not, it actually has nothing to do with the issue that Hunter Avallone's talking about, so that on its own is very deceptive. But it actually gets significantly worse, because this line right here is overall productivity in the private sector, and it's being compared to the typical worker, meaning that the productivity that we're seeing in this top line includes the work of managers, highly specialized supervisors, and people who are likely to boost up their productivity. However, what we're seeing in this bottom line doesn't include any of those positions. So already we have an apples to oranges comparison. If you were to include these highly specialized positions that are in the productivity, in the wages compensated, then the lines would look more like this. To see this data in another way, I'm including this chart. Now, this chart also includes the compensation for those highly skilled workers, but it doesn't combine them with the unskilled workers or the typical workers as referenced in the EPI chart. As you can see, it makes a huge difference when you include the productivity of this group, but not their wages to the gap that we're actually seeing. But it goes even further than this, because one of the things that I always find incredibly deceptive is how you measure inflation in these charts. But this chart is one of the most deceptive pieces of propaganda I've ever seen in my entire life. Now, a common inflation metric you might have heard of is the CPI, or Consumer Price Index. Another less common measure of inflation is the IPD, aka the Inflation Price Deflator. Now, which of these two metrics do you think are being used for this chart? Think about it for a second. If you want to write in the comments A for the CPI and B for the IPD, then I'll accept that. Also in the live chat, just write A or B depending on what that corresponds to. And you're going to be wrong, because the answer is both. You see, the productivity is measured with the IPD, the Inflation Price Deflator, but the hourly compensation line, this line right here, is being measured with the CPI. Now, the reason this is incredibly important is that although these both measure inflation, they do it in completely different ways and they're not comparable. One of the criticisms of the IPD is that it is deflationary. One of the criticisms of the CPI is that it's overinflationary, i.e., it overestimates the cost of inflation, meaning that these two metrics are chosen in such a way that this chart is less subject to inflation on this end, but more subject to inflation on this end, meaning it is deliberately designed to boost up productivity while lowering hourly compensation for the typical worker. If you were to chart these using the same metrics for both, which is a basic thing that you would do in statistics, the charts would look like this respectively under the CPI and under the IPD. Now, I've never been to the Hunter Avallone School of Free Thought, but using advocacy statistics that are deliberately designed to increase the gap to advocate for your policy by leaving things out and using different inflationary metrics for things on the same chart seems a little not free thinking for me. It seems like something I don't want to sign up for. It seems a bit deceptive. Now, I'm not accusing Hunter Avallone of being deceptive. I'm accusing Hunter Avallone of not knowing any better. He didn't look into this chart at all. There's no way he would have presented it, or anyone would have presented it had they looked into it for themselves like I did.
So would raising the minimum wage incrementally to $15 an hour really help? Well, according to the vast consensus of economists, the answer is yes. In a letter signed by 100 plus PhDs in the field.
So he also talks about this letter and says that 100 economists signed this, 100 PhDs, saying that you should raise the minimum wage to 15, and he calls that an overwhelming consensus.
So would raising the minimum wage incrementally to $15 an hour really help? Well, according to the vast consensus of economists,
which is really interesting because I trolled around the Economic Policy Institute's website, and even though this is the organization where Hunter got his data sets, and this is the organization that is advocating for the minimum wage, according to them, the overwhelming consensus among economists is that you shouldn't raise the minimum wage, not to $15, no way. But Hunter must think that there's like 105 economists in the nation total if he thinks that 100 signing one letter is an overwhelming consensus.
According to the Congressional Budget Office, the $10 minimum wage would raise earnings for up to 3.5 million workers and have virtually no effect on employment.
So this is another thing that I noticed from Hunter Avallone, is that he uses outdated numbers to point out that there's not that bad of consequences in raising the minimum wage to a much lower point than he's advocating for in his video. For instance, he talks about the Congressional Budget Office study that says there would be no real discernible effect on employment if you raise the minimum wage to $10 in a video where he's advocating for a $15 minimum wage. Now, this would be one thing if we didn't have CBO data on what they think would happen if we raise it to $15 an hour, but we do. And they said 900,000 people would be lifted out of poverty, but 1.4 million jobs would be lost. So maybe that data wasn't presented because it's not as interesting or compelling as the data that references a more modest increase in the minimum wage. But this isn't the only time that he does it.
This is not just conjecture, this is supported by the data. Extensive research has found that modest increases in the minimum wage had little or no negative effects on the employment of low-wage workers. According to a recent piece of economic research that examined the effect of prices on minimum wage increases in various states in the US from 1978 through 2015, found that a 10% increase in minimum wage only accounts for around a 0.36% increase in prices.
So he talks about marginal increases in the minimum wage here, and he clarifies later that he's referencing 10% increases in the minimum wage and the negative consequences from those 10% increases. But we're not discussing a 10% increase of the minimum wage. We're talking about more than doubling the federal minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 an hour. But it actually goes further than that, because remember, the law being proposed that's being discussed, as Hunter said in the beginning of the video, gets rid of the tipped minimum wage, which is currently at $2.13.
It would also eliminate the sub-minimum wage of $2.13 for tipped workers.
So we're multiplying that by 7 to 8 times what it currently is, and Hunter's giving me data on 10% increases in the minimum wage, as if that's any way applicable.
Personally, I believe an interesting solution to promoting small businesses would be allowing them to opt out of the minimum wage if they operate as a worker co-op.
And then he wraps it up with this, that co-ops will have an exemption from the minimum wage, because in all other circumstances, you, the individual, and you, the employer, can't be trusted to work out your own wage below a certain amount. However, if you join a co-op on the promise of potential future profits, the same way that a waiter waiting tables does it not for the hourly wage, but does it for the tips that they expect to get, that's going to be okay as long as you're in Hunter's favored industries. As long as you're in the left's favored industries, you're going to get this artificial advantage over other industries in not having to pay the same amount, because you might share future profits that may or may not exist down the line. That's totally fine. Everybody else, totally too stupid in order to negotiate their own wages. It just makes perfect sense to have the government do it for it, because it's minimum value of labor. Just think about it. Look at this chart that I debunked freaking 4 different ways. Now, normally, I'd leave it right here. I've owned my opponent with facts and logic, destroyed them on the internet, as the kids would say. TheInternet.com will never be the same for Mr. Hunter Avallone. Everybody would cheer, and that would be it. However, I promise you a bit of a bonus, and the reason I'm making this whole entire video, because I could have responded to any lefty making the same bad arguments about the minimum wage because they all use the same flawed data sets, is because of this clip of him talking about David Dorn.
I'm thinking of the family of David Dorn, the black retired police captain who was shot and killed while trying to protect a friend's pawn shop from looters.
I don't know about this David Dorn guy. I mean, have you looked at his past? I've heard this guy was no angel, man. Hey, I think maybe he was on fentanyl. I don't know, man.
Protect a friend's pawn shop from looters.
I mean, you'd have to be on some kind of kooky drugs to go and literally risk your fucking life to protect someone's pawn shop.
So one of the things I will never understand about people in politics, and especially this is true of leftists, is that they have this weird compulsion or this weird need to take down people that are uplifted by the opposing side just because they were uplifted by the opposing side. So Hunter Avallone decides that he's going to insult David Dorn for dying in a pawn shop, saying that you'd have to be on some kind of kooky drugs in order to die defending a friend's pawn shop, because he thinks this is a clever point, because people talk about the past drug use of George Floyd, and specifically the drug use related to the arrest of George Floyd, which may have been a contributing factor, if not the cause of his death. Remember, his autopsy showed no fatal injuries to his neck, but it did show a fatal level of fentanyl in his system. Hunter denies this reality, and he thinks that this is all a smear on George Floyd's character. Now, on this channel, by the way, we don't talk about George Floyd's past criminal history in relation to this incident because it isn't relevant. However, people who do talk about that past criminal history are usually doing so to rebuff the idea that George Floyd was some kind of a saint. So while I cover the case so it's not relevant, I understand why other people bring that up in that arena where it is relevant. When you're talking about his overall character, yes, his past is relevant. When you're talking about this case, what was in his system at the time is all that's relevant, and how he acted is all that's relevant. But that's all stuff I've covered in more detail in other videos. We're going to set that aside and talk about David Dorn's past and why David Dorn died protecting that pawn shop. And it was actually told to us by his wife when she gave her address to the RNC.
Was his friendship with a young man named Lee. David met him when Lee was just a kid, after members of his family were attacked and murdered. Dave took a special interest in the boy. They bonded and their friendship grew and remained strong throughout the years. Lee eventually opened a pawn shop. He trusted Dave implicitly and asked Dave to help with security. David readily agreed. Whenever the shop's alarm would go off, the alarm company called Dave. He would investigate. If he got a call after I went to bed, he would wake me up and tell me he was going to Lee's, just to make sure everything was all right.
Some of you might not know that when you're in college and you're getting your degree in criminal justice, you have to take several courses in policing. And there's one part from that policing course that really sticks out to me when I hear David Dorn's wife talk about why David Dorn died defending the pawn shop. And that's the idea of noble cause corruption. Let me explain. You see, you study two different types of corruption in relation to the police. The first is economic corruption, which is self-explanatory, don't need to go into it. And the second is noble cause corruption. And it's this idea that sometimes the job or devotion of the job can lead to cutting corners and creating problems. Now, there's two aspects of noble cause corruption, like this idea that cops can be driven by something related to the job with good intent and ultimately do bad things. The first one, I don't remember. But the second one is called the smell of the victim's blood or the scent of the victim's blood. And essentially what the textbooks argue that talk about this is that for some officers, the scent of the victim's blood can weigh so heavily on them because that's all that consumes them, that it influences their actions, and it can influence their actions to such an extent that it's actually considered something to watch out for because it could be a corrupting influence. Now, David Dorn, the reason he died protecting that pawn shop is because of this phenomenon. However, it wasn't a corrupting influence. It led him to be one of the most honorable people I've ever heard described by somebody post their death. Because he met the guy, Lee, who owned this pawn shop when he was a kid, and he was a beat cop serving that community, and members of this kid's family got murdered. So routinely, throughout his life, as he was a cop, every time alarms or there were issues with this kid, David Dorn would go there and try to help. So on the night of the Black Lives Matter riots, when the alarms sounded off, Dorn did what he normally did, and he went to go protect Lee.
After I'd gone to bed, David received a call from Lee's alarm company. The front door of the pawn shop had been breached. This time he didn't wake me up to tell me. He probably knew I would have tried to stop him or insist on going with him. As I slept, looters were ransacking the shop. They shot and killed David in cold blood, and then live streamed his execution.
Now, obviously, Dorn wouldn't be the only person to be notified if something went wrong in the pawn shop. Lee, the owner of the business, the same person Dorn met as a kid post his family being murdered, that he's been trying to help his entire career as a police officer, and post that, would have also heard that alarm.
I mean, you'd have to be on some kind of kooky drugs to go and literally risk your fucking life to protect someone's pawn shop.
So Hunter, if you were curious, what would motivate David Dorn to go out in the middle of the night during rioting to protect a pawn shop? That would be it. Because David Dorn was so motivated by the smell of the victim's blood that even retiring as a police officer didn't stop him from trying to help this victim. That's why David Dorn was out there, and it's incredibly embarrassing that you would ascribe more fault to the guy defending from criminality than the person who murdered David Dorn for Use TV. And for all the lefties like Hunter Avallone who like to hide what they actually believe about the police, saying that they don't hate police, they're not anti-law enforcement, they're just pro-good police. They want law enforcement to do better. What is with you and your compulsion to take down David Dorn? Why do you have to attack this guy? He was doing objectively honorable things when he died for honorable reasons, and we have no indication that his service was in any way, shape, or form a negative on society. Just the opposite. And yet you still want to take him down after he died.
I don't know about this David Dorn guy. I mean, have you looked at his past? You know, I've heard this guy was no angel, man. Hey, I think maybe he was on fentanyl. I don't know, man.
David's grandson was watching the video on Facebook in real time, not realizing he was watching his own grandfather dying on the sidewalk.
Is it not bad enough that David Dorn's grandson was watching the rioting live when his grandfather was murdered right before his eyes? Do you have to attack him on top of that? Do you have to put it out there that you think he's an idiot, he's stupid, because you don't understand that level of honor or sacrifice for another person? Is that really necessary? Like, we don't want you to become advocates for David Dorn because we don't want you on the same side as us because we don't want to be anywhere near you. But can you at least shut up when it comes to this man? You don't have to insult him. Don't kick the man and his family when he's down. That's really how I wanted to wrap this video up. You guys know the drill with the liking, sharing, subscribing, blah, blah, blah. Till next time.